Thank you. It's great to be asked to speak to you today about what we've been doing in England to try and tackle some of the issues that Ken's talked through just now. As Andrea said, I work for the National Health Service in England. This is our focus within the National Specialised Commissioning Team. So I'm going to talk about why in England we felt we needed a different process to look at these very, very highly specialised products. So not the majority of orphan products, but what you would probably refer to as ultra-orphan products, we call highly specialised. Talk about that process, some of the lessons we learned from the pilot, and the challenges we're facing going forward. Like I said, just to try and prove, we're talking about this bit at the top. So this is the current, although I think it's about 2 weeks out of date now, so things have changed, process for commissioning services in England. And the highly specialised services are currently nationally commissioned, so we have national decisions about them. And they include things like heart and lung transplants, retinoblastoma, lysosome storage disorders. When this process was originally set up back in the 80s with the national level, it was very much looking at services. There weren't a lot of products around. We did set up NICE. It's been around for about 10 years now. You're probably all familiar with it. It's our sort of standard HTA process in England. And it looks at the vast majority of drugs. It's found looking at orphan drugs more of a challenge, and in particular, ultra-orphan drugs. So it hasn't tended to look at those. What's happened instead is individual local commissioners, local payers have taken local decisions. And unsurprisingly, they've not been consistent across the country. This has led to an awful lot of confusion, a lot of delays in decision-making, and a lot of frustration for patients and patient groups. So we thought, well, there must be a better solution to this. And this was the answer. So when I first heard the word Agnes, I thought, oh dear, I do not want to get shot by arrows defending my virtue. But it turned out that that's not what they had in mind. It was, in fact, the advisory group for national specialised services, so not quite as dramatic an image. And this was set up to provide a single source of advice to ministers, to our Department of Health, on both services, highly specialised services, and new highly specialised products and technologies. So in the past, when ministers had made these decisions, they'd had advice from clinicians, then advice from commissioners, then advice from regional strategic managers, and then advice from all sorts of other people. Thoroughly confusing, they got fed up of it. They said, put everyone in the same room, make a single decision, and let us know what it is. So that's what we did. We put all these stakeholders into the room. You'll see we've got patient and lay members, so they're an absolutely fundamental part of the group. We have health economists and ethicists and pharmacists alongside the clinicians, alongside the commissioners, both regional and local. And it wasn't enough just to put them all in a room and hope for the best. We thought we should have a bit more transparency about how decisions were being made. So we developed this decision-making framework, which Ken showed you earlier. It's a two-stage process. We have entry criteria, which I won't go into a lot of detail. They're fairly factual, hardly surprising things in that. There's some underpinning principles, things like using the best available evidence, being transparent, being robust in decision-making. But the heart of it is really the second stage, where, as you can see, we have put patient need right at the heart of that. And I can't stress that enough. It's fundamental to all the decisions, all the discussions that Agnes has. Essentially, this framework asks 4 questions. So we ask, does it work? And that's very much thinking of traditional clinical effectiveness. But then we ask, does it add value to society? So a wider societal perspective, rather than just narrow health benefits. We're looking at the benefits to patients, but also to carers and their families. And importantly, though challenging for us, and I'm sure for yourselves, is thinking about is it stimulating innovation? Is it actually contributing to progress above and beyond perhaps the progress of that individual product? And then the third area is it a reasonable cost to the public? So within there, you'll note some fairly standard cost questions that would certainly be considered by NICE, but we also ask, alongside the average cost per patient, what's the overall cost impact for England, for the NHS? And that's actually an important part of the decision. And then finally, we ask, is this the best way of delivering a service? You have to bear in mind this is applying to services as well as products, so that's particularly important for services. But when we get a product to consider, we've got to think about how will that be delivered? What's actually the mechanism? Should we approve it for it to be made available to patients in the NHS in England? Some special considerations around drugs. importantly, I think it's got to be aimed at a clinically distinct subgroup for around 500 patients or less in England each year. Now, building on what was said earlier, people talking about personalised medicine and genetic subgroups within diseases, that's not what Agnes was set up to do. It's definitely an issue, definitely a challenge for the future, but Agnes was really set up to deal with things like lysosomal storage disorders and eculizumab's another product that we've done. The other thing that within the drugs is we can't do retrospective. So the clock started on the 24th of September last year when Agnes came into existence, and for products that already had market authorisation for an indication, they're outside our scope. We're also not going to double run. We're not going to look at things that NICE is looking at. We've created two systems now. We've got NICE, we've got Agnes, and we need to be really clear about which goes into which. So we've developed this with NICE, in discussion with NICE, and they act as the gatekeeper. So all products go into NICE, and then they filter out those that meet the Agnes criteria or are likely to meet the Agnes criteria. And they do that in discussion with our team. They decide what to send to Agnes, but Agnes makes the final decision about what it's going to actually review. And that's about, can it add value? So is a full review going to be proportionate to the additional cost, perhaps, of the product? So for existing services, if we've got an alternative replacement therapy coming on board, we probably wouldn't undertake a full review. We would probably leave it to clinical discretion about how to use a product. We might not, but we probably would do that. Have to be good reasons for us to do a full review. But where it's for a new service, where there's no existing product, we would almost certainly undertake a full review. So we piloted this because we thought it's going to be a bit different. We don't want it to be exactly the same as the NICE process. That defeats the object. So working with Shire, as well as other partners, we ran the pilot process. And that involved an awful lot of meetings, which was interesting and great, but also exhausting. And it ended up resulting in a company submission, a patient submission, and a health technology appraisal report, all of which went into an Agnes discussion. And at that discussion, they had representation from the patient, from the company, from the clinical expert, from the technology appraisal team in the room, able to present, able to ask questions. So what did we learn from the pilot? Well, we learned that Agnes really liked the patient submission. I can't state that enough. They were raving about it. It was fantastic. But they also wanted even more from it and tasked us with going away and thinking about how we could make it even better. And Richard, who will be in the panel discussion later, has been helping us with thinking about how we can do that. So it's a challenge we think we're getting there. They also liked having access to the key partners on the day of the discussion, being able to ask questions, being able to probe areas that perhaps were less clear in the paperwork. And what they really wanted was a natural history of the disease, to understand what would happen without intervention. I know for these disease areas that can be really difficult, but it's something that certainly the committee recognised the challenges of getting it, but really wanted it if possible, and if it wasn't there, to understand why it wasn't. And that's really the theme throughout, that recognition that the evidence base is going to be different than for conventional diseases, but wanting to understand what evidence is there, what evidence is missing, and why is it missing. Where you need to extrapolate from other disease areas, explaining why did you pick this disease area? Which other disease areas did you consider and reject, and why? What are the benefits of this disease area you've selected and the limitations of it? So they wanted a lot more narrative than the NICE process is typically allowed. So we've tried to reflect that in the new paperwork. In particular, they also, as I said, wanted a bit more from the patient submission, more of a focus on the wider benefits beyond just the narrow health benefits, wanted better understanding of the impact on patients, on families, on carers, and more understanding of opportunity costs, a challenge that certainly, as Richard indicated, as payers we do face, we do have to think about it. But what they wanted to understand was more the context. It's a new committee looking at these products for the first time. What's the context? What are we already paying for? What kind of figures are we talking about here? So this is the process as it is. It involves the end products now, so the patient submission, technology appraisal report, the company's submission, and the clinical input. And we think that from the moment of an Agnes decision to put something through to a full review, up until the Agnes recommendation, up to ministers, which should take about 9 months. Now that sounded like a horrifically long time to me. But talking to industry, talking to technology appraisal teams, they said that's as quick as you can do it. Stop being overly ambitious, Josie. This is how long it's going to take. So that puts my plea out to companies, to industry, to say, tell us as soon as you can about a product. The sooner we know about it, the sooner we can set the ball rolling, and the quicker we can take decisions and the less delay we build into the system. But unfortunately, there's a bit of delay that is out of our hands. We make recommendations to ministers. Ministers make the final decision. And ministers being ministers, they take as long as they want to take that decision. Everything goes into a big black hole and we sit and we wait. And industry sits and waits and patient groups sit and wait, and then eventually we do find out. I'd love to be able to speed that up, but it's certainly not in my gift. Just briefly on the manufacturer's submission. We built on the NICE single technology assessment framework. We had to start somewhere, and our policy was that really we should be the same as the rest of the NHS where we can be, and only different where we need to be. So that was our starting point. We've built on that, and we've built from the lessons of the pilot. We now hope that the manufacturer's submission really reflects all of the criteria in the framework I showed you, and minimises repetition. I'm sure there'll be some still in there, but we've tried to strip out a lot of it. And we're trying to encourage that broader societal perspective, rather than a narrow focus on health benefits alone, and provide a lot more room for narrative. The message we had very strongly from Shai, the message we suspected already, was that the evidence isn't always there. There needs to be space to tell the story, not just to put numbers in a piece of paper. We do still need a health economic model, that is still part of it, but it is only part of the decision-making process. And it's complemented by the expert clinical input, by the patient group, by the health technology assessment, kind of triangulation of the evidence, where you've not got a lot of evidence. If everyone's saying the same kind of thing, our committee's going to have a lot more faith in it than if they're all disagreeing. So finally, what's next for us? Obviously, we're trying to embed this process. We've piloted it. We're now undertaking the first 2 full reviews. And of course, we'll be learning lessons from that as we go along. Horizon scanning, as I've said, we don't always hear about products as early as we would like. We do link into the National Horizon Scanning Centre in the UK and PharmaScan, but occasionally we are taken by surprise by products, and that builds in delay. And most of you are probably aware that the NHS in England is going through a little bit of change at the moment. Someone said that you could see this reorganisation from outer space, and it does feel like that. So part of our challenge is thinking, how's Agnes going to work in the new world, within the new structures? How are we going to keep these principles, keep this process embedded? And finally, I suspect all of you are aware that value-based pricing is being put forward as a policy within the UK, that from 2014, an alternative to the PPRS will be in place for new products, value-based pricing. And how's that going to work with ultra-orphan drugs? We think the principles in that policy, the areas that they want to look at, are exactly the same as the areas we've already put into our framework, so there's some consistency there. But how it will work, we don't know. So we're saying ask questions and share your ideas with us, because there's still a long way to go. Thank you.